There are few places in the U.S. that are better for warbler photography than the Magee Marsh Boardwalk and the Estuary Trail at Crane Creek State Park on the Erie Shore of Ohio, almost exactly halfway between Toledo and Sandusky. Warblers, if you don't know already, are those ridiculously small, ridiculously colorful, ridiculously fast and busy little birds with the bright spring songs. They are leaf and tree gleaners and cleaners, most often seen in the high canopy or low undergrowth, depending on the species, of moist forest. A few species nest on the Erie shore, but many more species, over 20 on a good day, will drop down in the wet, marshy forest along the lake shore during migration to fuel up before crossing the lake. They are so busy picking insects from bark and leaves that they are fairly oblivious to humans, even humans armed with cameras and big lenses. And they are, uncharacteristically, often feeding at eye level. The Warbler Show at Magee Marsh draws thousands of birders and photographers, and a large number of just regular tourists, to Ohio every May. Warblers are never easy to photograph, and they're only marginally easier to photograph at Magee than elsewhere. But that little bit of edge can make a real difference. I have visited Magee in the spring for the biggest week in American birding festival for over 10 years now, skipping the COVID lockdowns, using a number of different cameras over that time, and for many years I've taught workshops on point-and-shoot for warblers and easy warblers with mirrorless cameras. The past 2 years, I've used the OM system OM-1 and the M.Zuiko 100-400IS zoom. Last year with the original OM-1, and this year with the OM-1 Mark II. This, then, is what I've learned, and am still learning, about photographing warblers at Magee. First of all, my basic methods for bird and wildlife photography do not change. I still shoot in program with auto ISO and limit set for minimum shutter speed, that'd be 1/400th of a second, and maximum ISO, 12,800. Using the camera's digital ESP metering to determine the exposure. I still shoot in JPEG, with the picture control set to natural, with auto shadow control, gradation, and +1 sharpening. I still use 5 frames per second silent continuous shooting. I still use bird detecting eye tracking autofocus. However, while most of my bird shooting is done with the focus target set to all, allowing the bird detection and eye tracking to pick up the bird anywhere in the frame, for warblers, especially warblers actively feeding in dense cover, it's often necessary to get focus on that tiny bit of the bird you can see through random openings in the foliage. The all-focus target area does not work well in dense cover, since often the camera cannot detect the bird in the confusion of shapes and light and shadow. I use the single-point focus area. My goal is to get that center point on some portion of the bird that is high enough in contrast or shows enough detail through whatever window I can find, so that the camera snaps to focus and detects the bird, and then, most often, the eye tracking takes over. With the original OM-1, this was possible but more difficult. The target focus area and subject detection were always linked. That meant that if the focus target area went outside the bird detection box, or, more often, if the bird dragged the detection box away from the center single focus point area, the camera lost focus. With the OM-1 Mark II, you can set the linkage between target area and subject detection in 2 ways. 1. Target area priority, in which case it behaves just like the OM-1, or 2, all, in which case it continues to track the subject and the subject's eye anywhere in the frame, no matter where the focus target area is at that time. This is a huge advantage for warblers in dense cover, and I don't know why much more is not made of this very basic difference between the 2 focus methods and the 2 models. It's almost enough to justify the purchase of the OM-1 Mark II, even if you already own an OM-1. With the OM-1 Mark II, the camera only has to find the bird once, and then eye tracking takes over. Get that single spot focus area on the bird through whatever window you can find, and the bird's head lights up, and focus will follow. Magic. Okay, well, maybe not total magic. It works much of the time, but not all the time, with most birds in most situations, but not all birds in all situations. Sometimes the foliage is just too thick, and there are too many foreground obstructions for the camera to find the bird in the first place, even when you have the focus target area right on the bird. Sometimes there is a much more attractive twig or leaf between you and the bird that just sucks focus to itself. Sometimes the bird is just too active to even keep in the frame. There are a few tricks to making subject detection and eye tracking work as well as it can. I had hoped to find a birdie spot on the estuary trail to set up my tripod and mount the external monitor on the OM-1 to record some actual demonstration clips starring warblers, as, for good reason, tripods are not allowed on the narrow and crowded boardwalk. But it did not work out. Therefore, I enlisted our backyard catbirds to demonstrate some of the tricks. If you watch the clips closely, you'll observe a couple of important things. First, I'm persistent in getting the center spot focus target area on the bird through or around foreground obstructions, sometimes, but not all the time, with a half press to initiate focus, or the AF on button if that's your style. That's all it takes. The camera will detect the bird, locate the head and eye, and follow focus from there. If not, I simply let off on the shutter release, or the AF button, and try again. Mostly it either catches the bird or it does not. Try again. Occasionally, if it's already focused in about the right area, holding the shutter release half pressed or the AF on button down for a few seconds as the bird moves around will show enough of the eye so it can find focus. Wait for it. Don't full press the shutter until the camera has outlined the head of the bird. I, personally, don't pay much attention to the little white box that comes on to indicate the eye or the green indicator that comes on to indicate focus. I turn it off most of the time, as I find that if the bird's head is outlined, the eye will be in focus. I shoot several short bursts whenever the bird's head is outlined. Short. Then I look for another window if necessary, or recenter the bird at any rate, and start again. This works better than trying to pan with the bird moving through heavy foliage while shooting a long burst. Try to resist moving the center focus target area at all, as that will make the camera refocus. As long as the bird is in the frame and the head is outlined, keep shooting. You can crop later. Only recenter when the bird threatens to go out of the frame. You'll get more keepers that way. And I'm never afraid to crop. Ideally, the bird would fill the frame and be perfectly framed on every shot, but that's just not going to happen. With anything as small and as active as a warbler, I give myself some slack. I take every opportunity to shoot. That means I shoot everything that's in focus, wherever it is in the frame. I know I can clean it up later in post and make it into a more pleasing composition. I shoot a lot of frames. Even at 5 frames per second, you'll shoot 10 frames for every one that's in focus, or, to be more accurate, 10 short bursts for every one short burst that catches the bird in focus. Always, I celebrate the hits and try to forget the misses. If I missed the bird, there probably was nothing different I could have done to get it. I just keep shooting. This method works, but I don't expect and I don't require it to work every time. What fun would that be anyway? As it is, I'm bringing home more keepers with the OM-1 Mark II than I did with the original OM-1, and way more keepers with either of them than with any previous camera and lens combination, way more than I need of most birds. That said, I'm still working on forgiving myself and the camera for missing the bright yellow female prothonotary warbler on the stump tip with the green moss in its mouth only 6 feet from me. I'll get over it, but it's going to take some time. In this case, there was indeed something I could have done better. I learned, after a few days and several frustrating encounters, to touch the shutter button as soon as I started to bring the camera up to my eye, so, if necessary, it could wake up from its nap and begin to focus before I was on the bird. I missed a few photos, including that prothonotary, because I had not learned to do that. I also took a few shots of my feet once I'd learned to put my finger on the shutter button, but that's okay. Finally, If the bird's eye is visible and in focus, I don't worry too much about any remaining obstructions. If they're far enough out of focus, a bit of additional clarity or defogging in post will clean the image up some. If they're close to focus, they can add an element of environmental reality to the image. We're not after field guide perfect images every time. Sometimes it's okay to show the bird as we actually see it most of the time in the field. And to finish off, here are a few of my favorite warbler shots from this year. This shot of a singing prothonotary warbler was taken through foreground obstructions, twigs and even leaves. I took a short burst as soon as the head was outlined and processed several of them. Prothonotary warblers often approach very closely if you stand still and wait. Of course, this year at Magee, the warblers were all more scarce than usual and harder to see because of the foliage. So wherever one was being seen at all well, there was bound to be a scrum of photographers jostling long lenses. This is a case where I was in the right place at the right time. You can see some softness where out-of-focus foreground leaves were actually in front of the bird, but it is still, to my eye, a satisfying shot and a testimony to the effectiveness of the OM-1 Mark II's bird detection and eye tracking. This is also a partially obstructed shot from a different angle. I had just a tiny window to work with, but I was really interested in the actively preening black and white warbler and all that its wings and tail were doing. This is from the middle of another sequence, where I started shooting as soon as I had a box on the head, and continued to shoot until the preening was done, a matter of a second or two, so I got maybe 8 frames to choose from. This one shows just enough of the eye below the branch for me to pick it over the others. Not a field guide shot at all, but interesting enough to make me happy. This one is your classic field guide shot of a bay-breasted warbler. Bay-breasted is often a common bird at Magee, but this year I saw only 2. Fortunately, both of those birds were super cooperative, feeding around me for as long as I wanted to photograph them. I say around me, but again, there must have been 20 or more photographers working this bird, and part of the challenge was just staying out of each other's way. The 100-400IS zoom, with 800 millimeters of reach on the OM-1, allows me to stand back a bit further than most of the other photographers shooting with 400 or even 600 millimeter equivalent lenses. So I have an easier time getting the portrait shots when they happen. Cape May warbler is often one of the more difficult to see warblers at Magee, but not this year. Several individuals were showing along the boardwalk and out on the estuary trail, not as close as the bay-breasted or the prothonotary, but close enough for another full-faced portrait. Often with a shot like this, if I'm going to use it for any critical purpose, I will use the super resolution tool in Photomator after I crop it, but before I begin processing. If the light is good, the results are often equivalent to using at least a 1600 millimeter equivalent lens. For this magnolia warbler, one of my favorites and another warbler that was very scarce this year, I had to make do with less than optimal light in the understory and greater distances than I would have liked. Again, some creative post-processing produced a shot that looks like I was much closer than I was. Not my best shot of a magnolia ever, but I'm happy with it for this year. On the other hand, this prothonotary was too close for comfort. I was leaning over the rail of the boardwalk, and it was just within my 4-foot minimum focus at 800 millimeters. I zoomed out for some full-body shots, a huge advantage of the 100-400IS, but this shot is all about detail. To get the whole bird in the frame, I had to zoom back to 447 millimeter equivalent. And another prothonotary, this time actively feeding on some kind of caterpillars. I have several shots from this sequence that show the caterpillar well, but this is the one that shows it best. Again, this was in deep cover, shooting through foreground foliage, up under overhanging branches, and at my full 800 millimeter equivalent. Once that box outlined the head, I just kept shooting burst. My last warbler is another of my favorites, and one you rarely see below canopy level except at Magee and other migration stopovers. The Blackburnian. This one always reminds me of burning coals. I took as many shots of as many individuals as I found, which was not many this year, but I never did get the full-frame shot I wanted. The final image here is a composite, assembled in Pixamator Pro, with the warbler from the open sky shot overlaid on a foliage background. I would never try to pass this off as a legitimate photo, but it would certainly make a good field guide illustration. So there you have it. Everything I've learned so far about shooting warblers at Magee Marsh and elsewhere with the OM system OM-1 Mark II and the M.Zuiko 100-400IS zoom.